Hey, what's going on, guys? So in this video, we're going to look at GraphQL, and we're going to use a bunch of other technologies as well, but GraphQL is what I really want to focus on because I don't have that many videos on it. It's been a while, so I decided to do this full stack project. We'll use GraphQL, Express, in the back end with a MongoDB database. And then once we finish our API, we'll go ahead and do the front end with React and the Apollo client. All right, so the only prerequisites for this course is that you know basic JavaScript. If you are going to do the front end in React, you should have some React experience, but you could also do it with something else as well. You could use Vue.js or Svelte or Angular along with the Apollo client as well. So as far as the project goes, it's going to be a simple project management system where we can add clients, we can manage clients, add projects, we can connect projects to clients, and we'll have a project page to show all the information, including the client information, as well as an area to update the details, as well as a button to delete the project. So we'll have full CRUD functionality, and we'll be able to, we're using Bootstrap, so we'll be able to have some modals to add new clients and new projects. All right, so all in all, it's going to take about 3 hours or so. I would suggest that you follow along. I think that's the best way to learn. So before we even get into any coding, I'm just going to go over what GraphQL is, talk a little bit about queries, mutations, types, and so on. All right, so I hope you guys enjoy, and let's get into it. This video is sponsored by Masterschool, and this is kind of a special sponsor because I've been working with them closely and we're going to be collaborating quite a bit in the near future. So Masterschool is a network of success-based online schools, and they have programs for web development, data analytics, marketing, and more. And you can go to their website and apply to one of their online programs, and that includes 7 to 10 months of extensive training, followed by a 3-month career accelerator. And the great thing is you don't pay anything until you actually get a job. So they have graduates working at Google, Shopify, Facebook, and other great companies. So if you're looking to learn, find guidance, and land a successful position, click on the link in the description and fill out the questionnaire to apply for next semester. All right, guys, so before we jump in and start to work on our project, I just want to give you a quick crash course in GraphQL. Now, we're using a lot of different technologies here, but most of them I've done plenty of videos on. I have crash courses on. If you watch my Express and React crash course, that's enough prerequisites for this. Even if you didn't, if you have a basic knowledge of JavaScript, then you should be fine. All right, and again, on the front end, you don't even have to use React. If you want to use something else, that's fine. And the first half of this course is strictly the back end, strictly our GraphQL schema and API. All right, so what exactly is GraphQL? Officially, it's an open source data query and manipulation language for APIs, and it's a runtime for fulfilling queries with existing data. I know that's kind of a robotic definition, but you'll learn more as we go along, and it will make more sense. So it can be an alternative to a REST API with some added benefits, such as the ability to request the exact data that you want. To me, GraphQL has always been kind of a cross between a REST API and SQL, structured query language, because you get the same type of ability or HTTP operations as a REST API, but you also have the control of the request and response like you would with SQL. All right, and now I will be making quite a few comparisons with a REST API, but please don't take that as you should always use GraphQL. It's always better. I know the internet is very black and white. It's very binary, but there's different situations where, one is a better choice than the other. All right, so I put together this diagram of how a REST API works. I'm not the best diagram maker, so forgive me if this is a little confusing. But basically, we have our client, which is a React app, Vue.js, whatever. And usually, we'll make a request with one of these HTTP methods to our REST API. So get would typically fetch or get data. Post would add data or create. Put would be update, and delete, of course, would delete. And we have all these different routes that we create in our REST API, or these different endpoints, such as API projects. If we're updating or delete, we need to know which one. So we would do API projects ID. And then for every resource we have, projects, clients, users, blog posts, you'd have all these different routes to hit. And then you would get your data back, and your data would include all of the data. Okay, you're always going to get the same thing back when you hit a certain endpoint of a REST API. And your data will typically look something like this. It'll be JSON data. In this case, we have an ID, name, description, status, and client. Now, as far as GraphQL and how that works, it's a bit different. So we have our client, let's say React, and then we also have the Apollo GraphQL client that we're working with. So instead of making a post or put or delete or whatever, we're just going to create a query that looks something like this. And it looks very similar to JavaScript. So here we're saying we want a project that has the ID of 100. And then in these curly braces, we're saying we only want to get back the name of the project, and we want the name of the client, because client is related to the project. And I'll get into that and show you how to add relationships and stuff. But we would send something like this. It would go to our GraphQL API, which only has a single endpoint. So instead of having all these different routes, we're just sending it to this /GraphQL. And then the response data is going to include only what we asked for in our query, which in this case would look something like this, where we have our project, we're just getting the name, and then we have the client of that project, and we're only getting the name from that as well. Okay, so you can see how it's much more targeted than a REST API. So let's just look at this query one more time. Again, we're just asking for the client with the ID of 100, and we want the name of the project and the client. That's the response. And notice how it looks very similar to JavaScript, just looks like a JavaScript object, and it looks very similar to the response. So learning the syntax for queries and also mutations, which I'll talk about next, is actually really simple, especially if you're a JavaScript developer. I think that's why a lot of JavaScript developers they're more into seems like they're more into GraphQL than other languages. All right, now to add data to the server or to update or delete, we'd use something called mutations. So mutations are formatted very similar to queries, and this is an example here. We use the keyword mutation, and then we're calling this one add project. And inside the parentheses here is where we add our data. So in this case, we're adding a name of mobile application, a description, a status, and a client ID. And just like with the queries, in our curly braces, we're specifying what we want to get back. Okay, what do we want back from this mutation that we're making? And in this case, we're asking for the name, description, and status, and that's exactly what we get back. All right, so that's mutations. Now, when you're working on in your back end, for instance, when you're building a REST API, you usually use a tool like Postman, at least that's what I use, to make HTTP requests to your server while you don't have a front end. So in this case with GraphQL, there's actually a tool that comes with your GraphQL server called GraphiQL or GraphiQL. And it allows us to do just what I showed you. It allows us to make queries. In this case, we're saying we want the project with this ID, name, and client. That's what we get back. And we can also do mutations, and we also have access to our history, so we can make past queries. So it's a very handy tool and something we'll be using a lot in the first half. Now, GraphQL servers have a schema that specifies all the fields as well as their types. Okay, GraphQL is a strongly typed language, and the most basic component of GraphQL schemas are object types. So anytime we have a resource such as a project or a client or a blog post, recipe, anything like that, we're going to create an object type. So in our case, we're going to have a project and client object type. And then we also have scalar types such as string, int, float, boolean, and ID, which is a unique identifier. So you can see how that's formatted here. All right, so we'll be getting into that. There's other types we'll be using as well, such as enum and lists. There's a whole bunch of types to get familiar with. Now, when it comes to setting up GraphQL, there's a lot of different ways to do it, a lot of different technologies. What we'll be using is a package called Express GraphQL, which is a GraphQL server for Node.js with tools to use it with Express. There's also Apollo Server, which is another popular tool that you can use, and a lot of people use that with other JavaScript frameworks as well. And then there's even content management systems such as GraphCMS that will allow you to create a GraphQL API. So they're kind of like Sanity.io or Strappy, but instead of a REST API, they give you a GraphQL API. In fact, Strappy can also do GraphQL as well. A lot of them can. So this is just an overall look at the stack that we'll be using. I know it looks like a lot. Try not to let it intimidate you, but it's really not too bad. So the server is where we'll be starting, and we'll be creating just an Express server, initialize Express. We're going to listen on a certain port, and we're going to first of all just deal with data in a JavaScript file before we get to the database, just so I can show you how to set up GraphQL. We want to set up the GraphQL endpoint. We want to create our schema, create our queries, and we're going to be using the graphical client. Okay, then we're going to hook up a database. So we're going to be using MongoDB along with Atlas, which allows us to use MongoDB in the cloud. And then we'll use Mongoose to connect to MongoDB, as well as create our database models. Okay, once we're done with the server, we're going to start on the front end. I'm using React, but again, you can use whatever you'd like. And we're using the Apollo client to query our GraphQL API. All right, and then finally, I'm just going to use Bootstrap for the UI and for the styling. Okay, so that's kind of an overall look at our application. All right, so enough with the slides. Hopefully this at least gives you the gist of how GraphQL works. So now we're going to get into it and start on our project. All right, guys, so now that we talked a little bit about what GraphQL is and we looked at queries and mutations and so on, now we're going to start coding. And this is a page from the documentation that basically shows us how to set up a GraphQL server with Express, which is a Node.js backend JavaScript framework. And I'm assuming that you guys have just some very basic knowledge in Express at the very least. Maybe you watched my Express crash course. That's fine. You don't have to be a master in it. So there's three main things that we need to install. That's going to be the Express framework, GraphQL, and then there's also a package to basically connect them together, which is Express GraphQL. And then we essentially need to just bring those in. We create a basic Express server. And then instead of having all these different endpoints, all these different routes, as if we were creating a REST API, we basically have one endpoint, and that's going to be this /GraphQL, and that's where we run this GraphQL HTTP server, and that gets passed in a schema. And your schema can be one large file, or it can be broken up into you can put your queries into a separate file, or your mutations, etc. We're going to start off just having it all in one file just to avoid confusion, but at the end, we'll probably break it up into smaller chunks. So now we're going to open up VS Code, and I just have a completely empty folder here called Project Management App. And first of all, we're going to just run an npm init-y, which will just create a package.json file. And then let's install our dependencies. So we know we want Express. We want Express-GraphQL. We want GraphQL itself. If I could spell it right. And then there's a couple other things I want to install. One is going to be Mongoose, because we are using MongoDB as our database later on. So Mongoose will help us connect, and we'll create our database models and so on. And then I'm also going to set up cores and an optional package called colors, which I'm going to use later on. So let's install those as just our main dependencies. And then I have a couple dev dependencies as well. So npm install -D. We want nodemon so that it'll constantly watch our files and we don't have to keep restarting after we make a change. And then I'm also going to install .env, which will allow us to have a .env file to define all of our environment variables. Now what we want to do is create a folder for our server, which is going to be our GraphQL API. So everything that has to do with that, including our models and queries, our schema, all that stuff will go in here. And then later on, we'll have a client folder for React, or even if you wanted to use Vue or something else. So in server, let's create an index.js. That's basically our entry point. And then we're going to create just a simple express server here. I do have GitHub Copilot on, but I might shut it off because it might get too distracting. But let's create an app variable. We're going to initialize express, and then we're going to listen on a port. So let's actually create a port variable here, and I'm going to actually change this to 5,000. So it's going to first look in our environment variables for a port variable, which we don't have just yet, but I'll create that now. So in the root, I'm going to create a .env file, and then in here we're going to have a variable of port, and we're going to set that to 5,000. Okay, let's also add a node_env and set that to development. All right, and then in order for that to work, we do have to require the .env extension, so we can simply do require and .env and then just add .config. So we call that config method. And just to test it out, I'll actually put this to something different. Let's do 8,000. All right, and then we'll finish this up. So we want to listen. Let's do app.listen on that port, and then I'm going to do a console.log, and let's just say we'll say server running on port, and then we'll just put variable in here of port. All right, so now to actually run this, we're going to create an npm script. So in our package.json, let's change that to start. And then we're going to have that run node, and then make sure we go into our server folder and then index.js. And then to use nodemon, we'll copy that down and we'll set this to nodemon, and we'll change the name of the script to dev. All right, so let's go ahead and try this out. If we say npm run dev, okay, so now you'll see it says server running on port 8,000. So we know it's reading it from the environment variable. If it wasn't, then it would use 5,000. Now I'm going to stop this with Command or Control C, and I'm going to change this to 5 because that's what I want to use. I just wanted to test it out first. So we are going to change that to 5,000, and then we can go ahead and run that again. All right, now as far as GraphQL goes, we want to bring in, we'll go right here, and let's say const, and we want to bring in GraphQL HTTP. So let's say GraphQL HTTP, and that is going to come from Express GraphQL, that package that we installed. And then actually, I'm sorry, this should be a lowercase q. Yeah, so it should be like that. And then let's go down above where we have our app.listen, and we're going to create our app.use. And in here we want to pass in, just like we saw in the documentation, we have our GraphQL endpoint, and then we want, just like Copilot's telling us, we want to do our HTTP. Let's see, we're going to need that. All right, now in here we need to require a schema, which obviously we don't have yet, but we're going to create a file in the server folder. Let's create another folder called schema, and inside that folder we're going to create a file called schema.js. Now, like I said earlier, you can separate all your queries and mutations and stuff into separate files, but for now we're just going to put everything in this one JavaScript file. And then here we want to pass in, well, first we want to bring in the schema. So let's go right here. Let's say const schema, and we're going to set that to require the schema file that's in the schema folder, and then we can simply pass that in here. Okay, and if you called your schema file something else, then you would put, you would do this and then whatever the file name. But yeah, we want our schema. And then there's a tool called GraphiQL, which I do want to be able to use in development. So we need to set that here. And this is GraphiQL, GraphiQL. And instead of just setting it to true, I want to set it to true if we're in development. So we'll say process.env and then check our node env value. And if that is equal to development, then this will be true. Okay, so that way if we were to change it to production, then this would not be set to true, it would be false. Okay, now as far as our schema goes, we need some data to work with, and this could be from anywhere. When you use GraphQL, your data can be anything. We're going to start off with it just being in a JavaScript file, but it could be in a MongoDB database, as we're going to do later. It could be in a Postgres database. It could be just anywhere, any kind of database you can think of, or store you can think of, you can use that. So I have a file in the repository in the description called sample data. So I'm going to bring that in, or I'm going to, in the server folder here, I'm going to add that, and I'm going to call this sample data.js. And you can just bring it right in from the repo, but I'm going to just copy the content from it and paste it in. So basically we just have two arrays. One is projects, and you'll see the projects have an ID, a client ID, a name, a description, and a status. Okay, and I have, 5 of them. So 5 different projects, and then we also have clients. So here we have an ID, a name, an email, and a phone number. And there's 5 clients. There's basically, 1 client per project. And then we're just exporting those arrays. So this is what we're going to use for our data, just for now, just to make some queries and show you how we can set things up. Now we want to bring that data in, so I'm just going to destructure from that file. I want to get the projects array and the clients array. So we want to say require from, and we're going to go up 1 level into sample data.js. So that's going to bring in the projects and clients for us to work with. So from GraphQL, there's actually a lot of different things we want to bring in. So there's a couple ways we can do it. We can set this GraphQL variable to require, and then anything that we want to bring in from it, we're going to destructure. All right. Now, instead of doing this, we can save a line and just cut this out and set that to the require. So that's what I'm going to do. And the first thing that we're going to bring in here is going to be the GraphQL object type. Okay, so we're going to bring that in because when we have different resources like projects, clients, users, blog posts, whatever it is, you want to create a type for all of those. So let's start off with our client type. So we'll say client type, and we're going to call this, no, we'll just use that. Yeah, so we're going to do client type as a variable, and the convention is to use uppercase. And then we're going to set that to this new GraphQL object type that we brought in from GraphQL. And this is going to take in a couple different fields, a couple different values. First is going to be the name, which I'm going to call client. Then we have fields, which is actually going to be a function that returns an object. So that's what this is. It's a function, arrow function. It's returning an object. And then here is where we want to put our fields. So the first is going to be an ID, but I'm actually going to use the GraphQL ID type. So we do need to bring that in up here. We'll say GraphQL ID. And then I'm also going to bring in GraphQL string. You can see all the different options here. But yeah, I'm going to bring in string. And the other fields we're going to have are going to be a name. So we'll go ahead and do that, an email, and a phone. Now, to make a query, so let's say we want to get a client by the ID, then we need to create down here our root query object. So let's say const and say root query and set that to a GraphQL object type, just like we did above. And the name for this, we're going to set that to root query type, and then this also is going to take in fields. Okay, now this fields is actually, it's going to be an object, and these fields are going to pertain to queries. So for instance, if we create one called client, most likely that's going to be to fetch a client. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say client, and let's set that to an object, and that's going to take in a type of client type, which we just created up above. All right, now if we're getting a single client, we're going to need to know which client are we getting, so we'll need to pass in an ID. So this is actually also going to take in args, okay, so arguments, and it's going to take in an ID, and then we want to set that to the type of GraphQL ID. All right, so when we make our query from graphical or from Apollo within React, within our front end later on, we'll be passing in the ID that we want for this client. And then where we have our return, whatever we want to respond with, that's going to go in something called a resolver. So we have this resolve function that's going to take in a parent value, and arguments. Okay, I'll just call this parent. So parent and args. And here is where we actually want to return our data. Now, later on, we're going to be using MongoDB with Mongoose. So what we would put here is our Mongoose function to get a single client. Right now, we're just dealing with a simple file with some arrays. So this, what GitHub Copilot is telling me to use, I'll use that because it's just taking the client's array. It's calling the find function, which is a high order array method. And it basically just loops through and it finds where the client ID is equal to the args, the ID here that's passed in. Okay, now to be able to use this query, we need to, first off, we need to export this as a schema. So down here, we're going to say module.exports, and we're going to set that to a new GraphQL schema. So if we look down here, we should have that option right here. So new GraphQL schema, and that's going to take in an object with query, and we want to set query to our root query, which is this right here. Okay, and then we got to make sure that we bring this in, this GraphQL schema. It looks like it was auto imported. All right, and this list gets pretty long, especially if you're doing everything in a single file, but it's all stuff that we need. So now that we've exported our schema and we're including it right here, we can now make a request to our GraphQL endpoint, and we can do that with this graphical tool. We do have it enabled because we are in development, so this is setting that to true. So to access that, remember we're running on port 5000, so what we can do is just do HTTP localhost :5000 and then /GraphQL. Okay, and then that gives me this graphical tool where we can basically test out our queries. This is kind of like Postman when you're working with a REST API. And I want to make this a little bigger so we can see it. And these are all just comments. We can get rid of this. So let's make our query to get a single client. So what I should be able to do here is say, well, if we're making a query, we need to just have these opening curly braces. And as soon as I type a C in, you'll see I'll get this drop down because it knows what is available as far as our schema goes. And it knows we have a client query. So I'm going to say client. And then remember, we have to reference an ID, meaning we have to pass in an ID argument. So here, as soon as I put in I, it shows us ID. And let's say we want to get the ID of 1. And if we look at our data, so the data we're working with right now is just this sample data, and we're working with clients, and they all have an ID. So you can see Tony Stark has an ID of 1. So let's pass in that, and then we can open up our curly braces and just say what we want to get back. Let's say we just want to get the name back. So I can either hit this play button, or I can do a command or control enter. That's going to run the query, and you can see that I get back Tony Stark. All right, and I only get the name, right? I don't get the email or anything like that because I did not request that. That's the big difference between GraphQL and a REST API is I can get only the data that I want. I don't need a bunch of crap, I don't get a bunch of crap that I don't need. If I do want to get the email, then I can do that. I can get the email and I can get the phone, run that. I can also get the ID. So if I go up here, we'll say ID, run that, and you'll see now I get all the data. Typically with a REST API, you would just get all the data no matter what. And you would have all these different endpoints to hit. In this case, we're always working with that one GraphQL endpoint. So I think what we should do next is in our schema, I think we should create a query to get all clients. All right, so to do that, we're going to go into the root query here, and right after client, actually let's put it before it. We'll do clients, plural, and set that to an object. Make sure you put a comma there. So as far as the type goes, we're not going to set it to client type on its own because it's actually a list. It's a list of client types. So what we're going to set it to is GraphQL list. And the type of items that are in this list are going to be client type. So we do have to bring that GraphQL list in. So let's do that. We'll say GraphQL list. Okay, so that's the type. Then we don't need any args because we're just getting all clients, so we don't need to pass in an ID. So we can just go ahead and add our resolve function here. Takes in parent and args, and we're just going to return clients. So we're basically just returning the array, simple as that. So now let's save that, and let's go over to graphical, and let's see, we're going to, instead of passing in an ID like that, we're going to change this to clients, plural, and then put in here whatever we want, whatever data we want. I'll just get everything, and we'll click play. And it just has a red line because it didn't refresh the page. If I refresh, that line will go away. So now you can see what I get is this, we get a data object with a client's array. And that array has every single client object inside of it with all the fields. If I just wanted to, let's say, get the name, so an array of client names, then we could do that. All right, so very cool. Now let's do the same thing with projects. All right, so I'm going to go back to our schema, and just like we have a client type, we're going to need a project type. So we can actually copy this to make this a little quicker, and let's paste that in. This is going to be our project type. We want to change this to project type, and the name is going to be project. Actually, it should be an uppercase P. And then as far as the fields, we are going to have an ID. We are going to have a name. We're not going to have an email for a project, but we're going to have a description, which is going to be a string. So we'll just change that. And then we're also going to have a status. Let's say status. And we'll just do that for now. I do want to have the client available as well, but we'll just keep this for now. And then let's come down here into our root query, and I'll just copy both of these. So the clients and client, and I'm going to put that above and just change this to projects. And then let's see, the type is going to be it's going to be a list, GraphQL list, but of project types. And then we just want to return projects. And then for this one here, we're going to get a single project, and the type is going to be project type, and then the ID is going to be a GraphQL ID. And then when we resolve this, we're just going to take projects and then call .find, and then we'll change, let's just take this and change it to project. Okay, so it's just going to get the project that matches the ID. So now if we save that, and that should be all we have to do. It's all in our root query, which we included right here. So now let's go back to graphical, and let's change this to projects. And let's see if that works. There we go. So now we're getting the name of all the projects. Let's say we want to get the status. And oops, we don't need a comma here. let's say we want to get the status and the description as well. So if I run that, now we get both the status and the description in addition to the name. And I should be able to get a single project as well with singular project. And we'll pass in here ID, and let's say we want to get the first project, and there we go. So now we're just getting a single object that has that project in it. Now I would like to be able to also get the client data for the project, and this red line, that'll go away if I reload. I want to be able to get the client as well. So what we can do is in the type, so in our project type, we're going to add another field here. So let's say client, and the type of this is going to be client type. Okay, so this is how you can add relationships to different types or different resources. And this is going to have a resolve just like the others. And actually, yeah, we can use that. So I'm going to accept that from GitHub Copilot. And what we're doing here is we're finding the client where the ID matches the client ID of the project, of the parent. Okay, because client is basically a child of a project. So if we want to access any of the project data, we can do that with this parent. Okay, we haven't had to use that yet. And if you remember in our data, so in our sample data, if we look at the projects, they do have a client ID field, and it pertains to the ID of the clients. So with that, let's save, and then let's go back to GraphiQL, and I'm going to put in here client. Now, since client is a child of project, we need to specify what data we want from the client. So let's say we want to get just the name. So we'll go ahead and run that, and now you'll see we get, in addition to the project data here, we also get the client, and we can choose what we want from that client, which is really cool. So let's say we want to get the ID of the client. We can get that as well. So pretty cool. So now what I want to do is deal with our database, which we're going to be using MongoDB, because right now we're just fetching data from a JavaScript file, which ultimately, of course, isn't what we want. So let's go ahead and create our database. Now I'm going to be using MongoDB Atlas, which is basically just a cloud version of MongoDB, so you don't have to actually install it or anything. So you can sign up if you're not already signed up. I'm going to just log in with one of my Google accounts. I have quite a few MongoDB Atlas accounts, but we're going to use this one. I cleared it up, so there's nothing here. And obviously, if you just signed up, you're going to start from scratch, and there's no credit card needed or anything like that. They give you quite a generous free tier, free database. So let's go ahead and you're going to have to create a project first. I probably should have deleted this, but I just have a project called Project 0. And then in that project, I'm going to build a database, and I'm going to use the shared plan, which is free. So we'll say create. And for my provider, I'm going to keep that as AWS, keep all the defaults here. Cluster name is cluster 0. That's fine. So I'm going to click on create cluster. And then here we need to create a user for authentication. I'll just do Brad T1234. Password, I'll do the same. And make sure you click on this button here to actually create the user. And then down here, let's see, I'm going to connect from our local environment. And here you can just click on this add my current IP address, and it should add it. And then you can click on finish and close. And we'll say go to database. So it says we are deploying your changes. This could take a couple minutes. You see this little animated border. So you might have to wait a minute or two for this to get set up. Now, if we go to Browse Collections, you'll see that if you do have data, it'll show here. Since we don't, we're going to see this message. And I'm going to click on Add My Own Data. And then under Database Name, I'm going to call this, actually, I'll just call it mgmt underscore db. And then you can create a collection if you want. So we'll create the clients collection. I mean, you don't have to do this from here. With MongoDB, you can do it all from your app. You don't need to do it from the database itself. But let's click create. And then we should see here management DB and then clients. And if we had any data, it would show here. I wouldn't recommend using Atlas to look at your database, though. There's another tool called Compass, which I would suggest you install. You don't have to, but let's say Mongo Compass. And this is a desktop app that you can use. It's a nice GUI tool. You can download it. I already have it installed, so I'm just going to open it up. All right, so it's going to look like this. And of course, it's cross-platform. Doesn't matter if you're on Mac, Windows, or Linux. And then I'm going to go back to the overview and then connect. And ultimately, we want to connect to our application. But if you want to use Compass, you can click on this. And we can copy that and then go to Compass. And let's paste that in. And I'm going to just replace the test at the end with the name of my database, which was mgmt underscore db. And then where it says these brackets password, you just want to obviously put your password in there and then connect. And then we should be able to see our collections and data. Okay, so right here, management DB, and you can see the client's collection, which right now has nothing in it. But now we have a way to actually look at our database. You can see the tabs over here. All right, so I'm just going to keep this open. So if we need to check on our data, we can. Next thing I'm going to do is go back to this connection thing here and click on connect to your application. And I'm going to grab this connection string here and copy it. And then we're going to go into our application. And in our .env file, you want to add a value for, let's say, Mongo URI. And then we're going to paste that in. And again, you want to have your password in here. So Brad T1234. And then at the end, if you don't add a database name, it's just going to create one called test. I want to use my mgmt underscore db database. So I want to put that there, and we'll save that. And then if we just restart our server, we should have access to that environment variable. Now we're still not connected to the database. To do that, we're going to go into server and create a folder called config. And if you guys have taken any of my MERN courses, you know exactly what I'm doing here. So we're going to create a db.js file. And we want to bring in Mongoose to connect. So let's say Mongoose, set that to require Mongoose. And then we'll have a function called connectDB. And that's going to be an async function because Mongoose functions return promises. Oops. And then in here, we're going to create a variable called connection. I'm not going to use that. We'll say await. Actually, I will use that, but we don't need to pass this stuff in. So we can get rid of that. Yeah, so we just want to pass in to this Mongoose connect. Make sure that you await for this. And then on the connect, we're going to pass in our Mongo URI environment variable. And then we're just going to console log MongoDB connected. This is using the colors package that I installed. It's just going to show us the host, and it's going to be colored. Now, in order to use colors, we do have to bring it into our main index file. So let's go, we'll just go right here and say const colors, set that to require colors. And then we should be able to use that. And then finally, we want to export this so that we can use it. So module exports, connectDB. And then we're going to go to our index file. We're going to bring in that db.js file. So we'll go right here and say const. What are we going to bring in here? ConnectDB. And require that from config.db. And then we just need to call that function. So right here, let's say we're going to connect to database. and we'll call ConnectDB. So let's save that now, and we should see down here in the console this MongoDB connected. And for me, I use the colors package, but you don't have to. I just like it so I know exactly, it's like it catches my eye quick, so I know if we're connected or not. All right, so now we're connected to our database. So the next step is to create our Mongoose Models. So we're going to create inside our server folder a new folder called Models, and in here let's create a new file in Models called client, so uppercase C client.js. And then in here we want to bring in Mongoose. And what we do here is create a Mongoose schema. I'm sure that a lot of you guys have done this before, but for those of you that haven't, a Mongoose schema is not related to a GraphQL schema. So just keep that in mind. You can think of it like this. You have the database, right? And then on top of that, you have the Mongoose layer, the object data mapper layer, where we create a schema that includes the fields for our database collections. And then on top of that is our GraphQL API, and that's where our GraphQL schema comes in. All right, so think of it as like layered. Now, to do this, we can just say const, and let's call this client schema. Again, nothing to do with GraphQL. We're going to set it to Mongoose schema, which takes in an object with the fields that we want. So let's say we want a name with the type of string, and then I'll just copy this down twice. So clients will have a name, an email, and a phone. And they're all going to be strings. And then we just want to export it as a Mongoose model. So we'll say module.exports and say mongoose.model. And we're going to pass in the name, which is client, and then the schema that we just created here, the Mongoose schema. So we'll save that, and then let's just copy all this. We'll create one more model file, which is going to be called project.js. Models should always be singular. It's the convention we should follow. And then we're going to replace the 3 instances of client with project, and then just add the correct fields. So a name, then we'll have a description, and we're going to have a status. Now the status, I only want it to be able to have a couple different values. So we're going to call this, we're going to give this an enum. And I don't want active and inactive. I mean, you can use whatever you want, but I'm going to have not started as one of the values for the status, and then in progress, and then completed. Okay, and I'll show you in GraphQL when we create our mutations, you can actually set the status input to have to be in an enum. And then the last thing here we want is a client ID. Now the client ID is going to have a type of Mongoose schema types object ID. So basically when you create a new record in a collection, it's always going to get assigned an ID. It's actually an underscore ID, and that's called an object ID. It's created automatically. We don't define it here. So what I'm saying here is I want this to be an object ID, but I want it to relate to another model. Okay, and we need to define that with the ref. So if I say ref, I want to define that to the client model. So this client ID should pertain to the ID of the client model. And that should do it. So we'll save that. We can close both of those client and project files. And now in our schema.js, we can now bring in our MongoDB, or I should say Mongoose Models. So let's go up here. And let's see if GitHub Copilot gets it right. I'll say Mongoose Models. Yep. There we go. Pretty cool. All right, so we bring in the project and client models. Now we can use those to query the database. So let's go down to our queries, and the first one here, so for projects, we're just returning the projects array from the sample data. So instead of doing that, I want to access my database. So I'm going to use the project model, which has a function or a method of find. And I could find by certain arguments, but I want to get just everything, all the projects. So that's all I'm going to do here. Actually, we want to return this. Okay, and then let's come down here. So this one is getting it by the ID. So I'm going to return using my project model. I'm going to use find. We're going to say find by ID, and then I'm going to pass in the args.id, which comes from this right here. Okay, then down here, we're returning all the clients. So let's say return client find. And then here, we're getting the client by ID. So again, we're going to return client find by ID. And then up here, when we define the project type, we also said, well, the client is is going to be a field in the project. So here, we're finding all the clients that have the client ID field that matches the actual client ID. So we can do clients find by ID, and then we have access to parent, which is talking about the project, and then the client ID field. Because remember, in our model, in our projects, we have a client ID field. All right, so let's save that, and we should see no errors down here. And if we come back here and I make the same query to get all the projects, it works. I just don't have any data. Okay, but seeing this and not seeing any kind of error is a good sign. So now what we want to do is have the ability to actually add clients and add projects. So what that is, those are mutations. Okay, so you have queries when you're fetching data, you're getting data. But if you want to add or change or delete data, those are going to be mutations. Okay, you're mutating the data in the database or wherever it's being held. So let's come down. Actually, you know what? We can remove this because we're not dealing with this sample data.js anymore. You can delete that file if you want, but I'm going to just keep it there so you guys have it in the repo. All right, but let's come down here. And you know what? One thing I wanted to do is initialize a Git repository. I actually wanted to do that a while ago. So I'm going to open up another terminal here. And let's go ahead and initialize a Git. You don't have to do this, but I just want to do this. So initialize Git, and then let's say Git. I'm just going to add everything. Well, actually, before I do that, let's create a git ignore file. So in the root, I'm going to create a .git ignore, and we don't want node modules. I think that's all we don't want, right? Yeah. Probably not the .env either. So we'll go ahead and add that as well. And then let's do a git add all, and then git commit dash m, and I'm just going to say project and client queries. Okay, so at least I have that in my repository. So let's get back up here, and now for mutations, what we'll do is create under all this stuff right above the module exports. Let's say mutations, and we're going to have a variable called mutation. So mutation, and we're going to set that to a new GraphQL object type. So let's close that up, and then inside there, we're going to give this a name. So you can see everything is an object type. So mutations, queries, etc., the root query. And then for fields, we're going to have, let's do add client first. So fields, add client, and that's going to be set to an object. We want to close this fields object as well. And before we even do anything, I want to add down here mutations. Okay, or is it just, yeah, mutation. And since I called the variable mutation, I can just do this. If I called this, my mutations, then I would set it to my mutations. All right, now for add client, basically we're gonna put here what is this? What are we creating here? And it's going to be a client type. So we want to set the type to client type. Then we have our arguments, and our args are going to be the fields that we want to add. So for example, we have a name. All right, so name, it is going to be a GraphQL string. However, if you don't want these to be null, like if you don't want somebody to submit a client and not add a name, right? So in that case, we're actually going to bring in something else from GraphQL. So we're going to bring in GraphQL not null or non-null. Okay, and then what we can do is where we set the type for this name, we're going to wrap this in GraphQL non-null, but we're going to wrap the GraphQL string in it. Okay, just so they have to put this name in. And I'm going to do the same for the email and phone. So let's change this to email, and let's change this to phone. All right, and then underneath the args, we have our resolver. So let's say resolve takes in parent and args. And then actually, yeah, we can do that. So let's take a look at what GitHub Copilot just recommended. And this is actually what I had. So we're creating a new client using the Mongoose model. So new client, we're passing in the values or the properties and the values or key values. And these are going to come, these arguments are going to come from our GraphQL query, which ultimately will be coming from a form on the front end. And then down here, we're just saying we'll take that client that we just created and then save it to the database. All right. You could also use the create method. You could just take the client model and you could say .create, and then you could pass in your fields, or you can do it this way. Now let's go to GraphiQL and try to add a new client. So I have a gist file. If you just search for Travesty gist, I have a gist of all the queries and mutations for this project. So get names of all clients, get single client name and email, get name and status of all projects. So we've already kind of did this stuff, but let's look right here to create a new client and return the data. We would do this mutation and then add client, pass in the data, and then whatever we want to return from that. So you could just copy that if you want, but I'm just going to type it out. So we're going to do a mutation, and we have a mutation called add client that should show up, I believe. Add client. That's weird. I thought it was supposed to show up. Well, anyways, let's pass in here. Let's say name. We'll do Tony Stark. And let's say email is going to be ironman@gmail, and then phone 1 2 3 4, and then what we want to get back from this, we'll do, actually we'll kind of get everything. So let's do ID, name, email, and phone. So let's try to run that, and there we go. So we added it to the database, and then we got back the ID, name, email, and phone. So this ID, this is an object ID that MongoDB created. In fact, I'm going to open up Compass now, and I should be able to, if I hit this refresh, we now see that we have Tony Stark in the database. All right, so again, we have our MongoDB database, and then on top of that, we have our Mongoose ODM, and then we have our API, which is what we're creating and working with right now. So we're able to add clients. Let's add another one. We'll do, let's do Peter Parker. And let's see, email. We'll do Spider-Man. Phone number, we'll just change some of these around. All right, so we'll add that. There we go. Now if I come back to Compass and I refresh, you now see I have these two clients. All right, cool. So let's continue on with creating our mutations. So that was add client. Let's do one to delete a client. So I'm gonna go right under add client, so that ends right here. And I'll just put a comment here. We'll add one here as well. All right, so this one, let's say delete client. And the type is going to be client type. Args, we're going to need an ID. And we'll say it's non-null. And then for the resolver, we're going to use the Mongoose method return by ID and remove. Okay, so we're going to use that. And I think we should be all set, really. Ultimately, I do want to, if we remove a client and there's a project that client belongs to, I do also want to delete the project, but we'll get to that a little later. Let's just make sure we can delete the client for now. So let's open up GraphiQL here. I'm just going to reload, and then I'll add in just a dummy. I'll just say test and run that. Okay, so what are we getting? Duplicate key error ID. All right, so the email is duplicate. We can't do that. So let's say Spider-Man1, and there we go. So now we have this client here. So I want to delete it. So in my mutation, let's say delete client. You can see it pops up here, and then we're going to pass in the ID of the client I want to delete, which is going to be this. So, whoops, that should be in quotes. So that's the ID that I want to delete, and then I'll return the name. So we'll go ahead, and now that should delete it, and I see just test. Now I do want to be able to, let's see, let's actually fetch all of the clients now and make sure that this test is not there. So instead of a mutation, we're going to do a query. So clients, we want all clients, and we'll just get the name of each one. And there we go. We only have Tony Stark and Peter Parker. So there's no test. So that was deleted successfully. All right. So that's really, those are the only two mutations that we're going to need for clients. We don't need to update them. If you want to do that, you can, but our projects are going to be full CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. So let's work on adding a project. That's going to go right under delete client. Okay, so delete client ends here. So we want to go right here. Let's say add a project, and we're going to have a, let's say add project. All right, so the type for this is going to be project type. The args, we're going to have a name, which is going to be a GraphQL string, and it's going to be non-null. Then we have the description, same thing. Now for the status, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to use an enum type. So if we go up to the top here, I'm going to bring in GraphQL enum type. So an enum just allows us to specify a certain range of values that it can be. Okay, so we'll have like new or not started, in progress, and completed. And we actually used enum in the Mongoose model as well. So we want it to be one of these three. So for status, let's say we're going to set that to some curly braces. And as far as the type goes, we're going to set it to, we're actually going to set it to new GraphQL enum type. Okay, and then that's going to take in some curly braces, and we need to specify a name that needs to be unique. So we're going to set that to project status. And then we have our values, right? So our values, open, no, I'm not going to do open. I want this to be the actual value is going to be not started. And then for this, I'm going to call it new. Okay, so we have new, then let's do progress. And we'll say in progress. And then this is going to be completed. And the key for that will be completed. So it has to be one of these values. And then I want to give it a default value of not started. Or, I mean, you could make it whatever you want. But let's go under, let's see, this is where the type ends right here. So let's put a comma here, and we're going to set a default value. And let's set that to not started. Okay, and then we also want to have a client ID field. So let's go under the status field, which ends right here. And the client ID is going to be a GraphQL ID, and it's going to be non-null. Now, as far as the resolver, we want to add that as well. That's going to go under the args. So right here, let's put a comma, and let's say resolve. Actually, let's see what GitHub Copilot is giving us. Yeah, so that's good. So in the resolve, we're going to create a new project using the project model. We're passing in all the fields with the values coming from the args, and then we're saving the project. Okay, so pretty simple. So let's save that, and let's try adding a project. So I'm going to go to graphical. Now I do need a client ID if I want to add a client. So let's get from clients, we'll get the IDs, and let's take Tony Stark's ID here. And then what we'll do is say mutation, and then we want to add a project. I don't know why it's not, oh, I think I have to reload. It should pop up. Let's see, add. Yep, add project. And then we want to pass in our fields. So let's see, name. Let's just call it mobile app. And then the description, I'll just say this is the description. And what else we have? Status. Now for status, I believe we can do the value of, let's say, not started. Or no, does that have to be the key? Let's say new. Or like this, new. Yeah. All right, and then for the client ID, that's where we want to paste in what I copied, which is Tony Stark's ID. And then what do we want to get from this? So we'll get the project name. Yeah, let's just get name, I guess name and ID. And then we'll go ahead and run this. And there we go. So we get the name back. Now let's go ahead and let's do a query for all the projects. So we'll say projects. Actually, this has to be wrapped. So projects. And let's get, we'll say name, status, name and status. I can't go on the next line. There we go. Status, and then we can also now get the client info. So I could say I want the client's name and the client's email. So we'll run that. Clients is not defined. That's weird. Clients is not defined. Hang on. Let me look at the query for a second here. Not the query, but the type. The project type. So right here. Resolve. So clients find by ID. That is not right. We need to use the model client. So let's try that again. And there we go. So we get all of our projects, which is just one. we have the name, the status, and then the client, from the client we have the name and the email. Now I'd like to create another project. So let's say mutation and then add project, and we want to give it a name. So I'll just say e-commerce website, and then for the description, it doesn't really matter. And then what else? Status. For status, I'll do progress. And then we also need a client ID. So I'm just going to grab that from Compass. If we go to clients, so this is Peter Parker's ID. So we'll grab that, put that in there. And then if we, actually we need to add our return data. So let's do name. We'll do name and say client, and I want to get the client ID and name. All right, so let's run that. There we go. There's our new project, e-commerce website. Let's create one more. I want one to delete, so I'm just going to call this one test, and we'll run that. Good. So now if we were to get all projects, and you can click on history here, and right here, projects, we'll go ahead and run that. We should have 3. Good. So we have 3 projects. Now I want to do a delete, and let's actually get the ID of these as well. So we want to delete this project. So let's go back into VS Code, and let's go under add project, which ends right here, I believe. Yeah, so ends right there. Then we're going to do delete a project. So let's say delete project, and we're going to set that to the type of project type, the args. It's going to take in an ID. Let's close that. Let's close that. And then under the args is going to be the resolve. So let's put a comma here and resolve. And we're going to use the model and call find by ID and remove, and then pass in the ID. So that should do the delete. So let's check it out or test it out. So we're going to do a mutation for delete. It's not showing up here, but delete project. And we want to pass in the ID of the project, which I'm going to grab from right here, this test one. Pass that in, and we'll just return from that the ID. Let's play it. There we go. Now if we were to go back to history and check the projects, and now we only have 2, so we were able to delete it. Now we want to be able to update a project. So let's come back over here and let's go under delete, and we're going to update a project. So update project, the type is going to be project type. Then we have our args, so ID, name, and then description. And I'm just going to close that for now, and then close that. So notice the name and description, we're not using GraphQL non-null, and that's because I don't want to have to specify a name or description if I'm updating. I want to be able to only update the name or only update the status, etc. The status now is going to be an enum, so I'm going to copy what we did up here. So it ends right here, so we'll grab that, and then let's put that right under description. Except I'm going to get rid of the default value. Okay, and then another thing, this name right here of project status has to be unique, and since we used it above, it's going to throw an error, so I'm just going to change it to project status update. All right, and then what we can do is add our resolve, which goes under the args. So that ends right here. So actually we need a comma. And then resolve. And to update, let's see, that does look good. So return, we're going to use find by ID and update takes in the ID of what we want to update. And then what we're doing is setting the values. So name, description, and status are getting set to the args values. And then we just have new set to true, meaning if it's not there, it's going to create a new project. All right, so yeah, that should do it. So let's try that out. So we'll come back over here and let's see, let's get the ID of these projects. So mobile app, let's grab that ID. And then let's do an update mutation. I'm just going to reload this. Okay, so let's do a mutation, and then we're going to say update project. It's going to take in an ID. So let's paste in that. So that's the ID that we're updating. And then for the name, which is mobile app, let's change it to mobile application. And then let's change the status. We'll change the status to completed. And that's it. We shouldn't have to add a description or anything. And then what we want to return from that, we'll return the name and the status. All right, so hopefully this works. All right, good. So now we get back mobile application and completed. And if we go and we list all of our projects, you'll see that that was edited, both the name and the status. They were updated. All right, so that's pretty much it. We're done with our API. This is all the functionality we need for our front end when we start to work on that. So if we just kind of go over what we've done, we have a project type and a client type. And as far as queries, we're able to get all the projects. We're able to get a single project, and we can also get the client because up here we specified that client is part of the project. So that means we can get the client name, the email, etc. when we query the projects. Then we can also get the list of clients. We can also get a single client by ID. And then for mutations, we can add a new client. We can delete a client. We can add a new project. We can delete a project, and we can update a project. So we have full CRUD functionality on projects. All right, so yeah, I think that now we're ready to start on the front end. So what we're going to do is close these up, and we're going to set up our client folder with React. So I'm going to leave the backend running here and just open up another terminal. All right, and then from here, we're going to run npx create-react-app, and I want to put it in a folder called client. So that way we have our server, our Express server with GraphQL in this folder, and then our entire front end will go in here and all our front end dependencies. All right, so the next thing we're going to want to do here is cd into the client folder, and then we have some dependencies we want to install. So let's install the Apollo client. That's going to be at Apollo/client, and then we're also going to install GraphQL on the front end. And also, we're going to have a separate page for projects. So we need the React router. So it's going to be React router DOM. And then I'm also going to use a package called React icons so that I can use some font awesome icons. And I think that should do it as far as front-end dependencies. Now make sure you're in your client folder when you run this. You don't want to be in the server folder or on the root. All right, and then we just want to kind of clean some stuff up. I will run the server. So from the client folder, we can do npm start, and that will run the front-end React server. That should open up. And I'm just going to make that smaller. Make this a little smaller so we can see both. All right, so let's go into the client folder, into the source folder, and I'm just going to do so a little bit of cleanup here. So the logo we don't need the app CSS, so we're going to delete both of those. It's going to break. Then we just go into our app.js, And we're going to delete these two imports at the top. And we're going to get rid of everything that's in this div right here. And then I'm just going to change this class name to container. We are going to be using Bootstrap. And then for now, we'll just have an h1. We'll just say hello world. Save that, and we should just see the hello world text. Now, I do have just a couple of assets to bring over, and you can get these from the link in the repository. I just have a GraphQL logo in this assets folder. So in source, we're going to have a folder called components. Obviously, that's where all of our components will go. And then we're going to have a folder in there called assets. And that's where I'm going to bring this logo into. So we want that to be, let's see, it should be in the assets folder. So move that. All right, so it should be in there. So also I have a little bit of custom CSS. We will be using Bootstrap, but I just have a couple classes where I'm overwriting like the primary color and stuff. So this index CSS file right here, I'm just going to grab some styles and paste it in. And you can just take the entire index CSS from the link in the repo and just replace it. So basically, I'm just replacing some styles for the nav bar and for the primary and secondary colors. And normally what you would do is compile your own custom Bootstrap file using Sass, but I don't want to get into that. So it's just a couple styles, so I'm just going to overwrite them. All right, we'll save that. And that index CSS is being brought in inside the index.js right here. It's being imported. All right, now as far as Bootstrap goes, we're just going to use the CDN. So I'm going to open up the public folder and then the index.html. And we'll go ahead and change this title here. I'll change it to Project MGMT. And then I'm going to grab Bootstrap. So we want get bootstrap.com. And you could use something like React Bootstrap, which is a UI library where you bring in Bootstrap components. But I didn't want to add an extra layer on top of everything. So we're just going to use straight up Bootstrap. And we just want to grab this CSS link, put that right in the head here. And then also the JavaScript bundle, because we will be using modals. So we do need that JavaScript. So we're going to paste that in as well, save that. And then if we come back over, we should see a change in the font and stuff. All right, so we'll close that up. And now we're ready to get going with some components. I think the first thing we should do is the header. That's pretty simple. So in the, let's close that up. In the components folder, we're going to create a file called header.jsx, or JS if you want to use JS for your component extensions. And then to generate a component boilerplate, I use this extension right here. You guys probably know this, this ES7 React extension, where you can do like RFC, would be a React functional component. You can see all the options here. I usually use RFC, but you'll notice if I do that, it does import React, which we don't need anymore. And with this extension, you used to be able to do underscore RFC, and it would give you the component without importing React. And I'm not sure why, but it doesn't do that anymore. So if I'm missing something, let me know. Maybe they changed the syntax up or whatever, but I've just been using it and then manually just, deleting that. So let's see, we want to have the logo that's in the assets folder. I'm going to import that. So let's say import logo from, and that's going to be in ./assets/logo PNG. All right, and let's see, we're going to get rid of that. And then this div, I'm going to change that to a nav tag with a couple classes. So let's do navbar, and let's do a BG. We'll do BG-light and margin bottom 4. And I'm going to just take away the padding. And then in there, we're going to have a container class. And then we're going to have our link, which is going to actually have a class of navbar brand. And that's just going to go to the home page. Later on, we'll use React Router DOM. So we'll use a link tag as opposed to an A tag. And then I want to have a class of dflex. So d-flex. and that's because I want to have the logo, but then I want to have the name, the app name. So we'll go ahead and add that. So we're setting the source of the image to the logo that we brought in. And then let's do just a div with the project name, which is going to be Project MGMT. Okay, so we'll save that. And then let's go over to our app.js, and we're going to bring the header in. So we want to import the header, and the header is going to go above this div here. Now we do have to have everything wrapped in a single tag, so I'm just going to use a fragment. Okay, so we'll have the beginning fragment here and the ending fragment here, and then put the header right here. And there we go. So now we have a nice little header. And we're not going to have any links here because we're going to have buttons to add a client and add a project. So I think the next thing we should do is just jump right into using Apollo, which is a client, to work with our GraphQL API. All right, we already installed it, but we do have to set it up a little bit. So in this app.js file, what we want to do is bring in our Apollo provider and wrap it around everything so that any components or any routes we have in here will have access to the Apollo client. Okay, so let's bring some stuff in here. Let's say import, and we want the Apollo provider. We also want, we want the Apollo client, and we also want in-memory cache. Okay, so we'll be working a little bit with cache because, like, when we add a client, for instance, we want the client to show right away in the list. We don't want to have to reload the page. So that's where this in-memory, if I can spell this damn word, that's where the cache comes in. All right, so we want to get that from Apollo client. And then what we need to do is create the client. So we'll say const client, and we're going to set that equal to a new Apollo client, which we just brought in. And what we're going to put in here is the URI to our GraphQL project, which is going to be, for me, localhost 5000. And then we just want to also add for cache, we're going to say new in-memory cache, which we brought in up here. Now, this doesn't do anything. It just sets this client variable. So what we need to do is wrap the provider around everything. So I'm going to go right here and add the Apollo provider and then pass the client in. Okay, and that needs to wrap around everything. So right here, we want to put the ending tag for the provider. And now we should have access to that. Let's see, Apollo client is not defined. Did I spell it wrong? I did. I don't know what's going on with my spelling today, but now we should have access to that. So the first thing I want to do that has to do with GraphQL is fetch our clients. Okay, so in components, let's create a new file. We'll call it clients.jsx, and we'll just do RFC, and we don't actually need that. And just for now, let's save it and bring it into our app.js. So import clients, and we're going to put this in place of the hello world. So clients, save that. Now we can see the clients component. So in here, I'm going to actually put the query, the GraphQL query in here, but after that, I'm going to move all the queries and mutations to their own folder. We don't want to bog our components up with that. But I'll do it, from here just for the first one. So we're going to import a couple things from Apollo. So we want to do at Apollo client, and what we want to bring in is GQL and use query. So GQL is used to actually make the query, but then to use the query in our component and get the data, as well as the loading state and any errors, that's where this use query hook comes in. So the query itself, I'm going to put above the component, above the function. So we're going to say const get underscore clients. That's kind of the convention, is to use all caps here. Set it to GQL, and then we have these backticks. Okay, we don't use parentheses, we use these backticks. And in here, we can create a query, call it get clients, and what we put in here is going to be exactly what we put in graphical. Okay, do I have graphical open? Yeah, I do. So I'm just going to take this out and make this a little bigger here. Right, so to get all of our clients, let's see, we don't have, oh, right here. So this here, we want to get all clients, and we're getting the ID, name, email, and phone. So if I go ahead and run that, this is what we get back. So this exact thing, what we have in these curly braces, is what we want to put in here. Okay, just like that. Now, to get the data that we're going to get from this query, we're going to use that use query hook. So let's say, we'll do it this way. We'll say use query, and then we just need to pass in here our get underscore clients. And then what we can get from that, we can destructure, and we can get from that a couple things. The loading state, whether that's true or false. Obviously, once everything is loaded, this will be false. Any errors, okay, so if there's an error, and then, of course, the data. So you can see that using Apollo and the Apollo provider is basically like its own state manager. So if we were using a REST API, we would have to handle this with like the context API or Redux or something like that. So now before we return the clients, we're going to check to see if it's loading. And if it is, we'll just, for now, we'll have a paragraph with loading, but later on we'll create a spinner. And then if there's an error, instead of just saying error, I'm going to say something went wrong. And then what I'm going to do is just return, let's open some parentheses, and we'll just have a fragment here. And then we want to check to see if not loading and not error, then, so we're just using the null coalescing operator here. Then we'll just do, for now, just an H1 with clients, and let's see what that gets us. So if we come over here, and we're getting something went wrong, and I think it's going to be a cores issue because I forgot to set that up. Yeah, so it's we get this access to whatever blocked. So what we need to do real quick is just on our server in our index.js, we're going to bring in cores. So we'll say cores equals require cores, and then we just need to add the middleware for that. So app.use, and then pass in the cores function, and that should fix that. So let's come back over here and reload, and now we don't get that message. We will see this download the Apollo dev tools. I don't really like the dev tools or use them. I do have it installed up here. Where is it? Right here, and it should give us a new tab, although it doesn't seem to work. And if you look at the reviews for this, it has a low rating and occasionally works, usually not, doesn't work at all. It doesn't work, it's not working. So we're just, we're not going to use it. All right, now if I reload, you'll see it does flash loading real quick. And then once it's loaded, it shows just this H1. So let's, we're going to actually use a table here to show our clients. So I'm going to get rid of this H1, and let's replace that. We'll put some parentheses in here. We're going to replace that with a table, and we're using Bootstrap. So for a class name, we're going to do table. Let's do table-hover, and let's move it down a little. We'll do margin top 3. And then here we'll have our table head. Let's just use table head. And then in here we'll have table row, and then a couple headings. So th, let's do name. We'll do name, email, phone. And then I'm just going to have this one blank because that'll be the delete button. And then underneath the table head, let's do the table body. And inside the table body is where we're going to loop through the clients, which we can get from data.clients, because, right, we're pulling it in here. If it's not loading anymore, there's no error, then this is going to load, so we'll have access to our clients. So let's go ahead and add that. We just want to, let's set that. And then in here, I could just put the table row, but I want this to be a separate component. So I'm going to call this client row. We'll add it in a second. And we just want to pass in the key, which is going to be the client ID, and then the client itself. So we have access to that as props in the client row. All right, let's go up here and import it, even though we haven't created it yet. We'll say import client row, and that's going to be from, let's see, where are we? We're in components, so it's just going to be ./client row, right? And then we're going to get an error because client row doesn't exist. So in components, let's create client row.jsx, and we'll create a component here. All right, and then as far as props, it's going to get passed in the client. So props.client, or we can just destructure. And then let's see. Let's return. We'll turn the table row directly. So this will be tr. Oops. What is going on? I hate when it does this stuff. So tr, and then the first column, so td, is going to be the client.name, and then we'll do the client email and the phone, and then the last one is going to be a delete button. So in here we'll say button btn, we'll do btn -danger since it's a delete button, and also btn sm small. And then in here I'm actually going to bring in the trash icon from React Icons. So we'll say import fa trash from React Icons /fa, and then we're just going to add that here, fa trash. Okay, so we'll save that, and now we should see our clients. What's this? This will go away, I think. Yeah, that should be fine. All right, so we're able to now see the clients in our database through our GraphQL API, right, through this query. So like I said, I don't want to keep the queries in the components, so I'm going to create outside of the components folder, still in the source folder, let's create a folder called queries. And then inside there, let's create a file, and we'll say clients. Let's call it client queries.js. Okay, and then what we can do is just take, so we'll take the entire query right here and cut that, and then let's paste that in. Now we do need this GQL, so let's import that. So we want to import GQL from Apollo, not Apollo Boost. We're not using that. Should be at Apollo Client. And then we just want to make sure we export this, and we don't want to export it as default, so we're going to use curly braces here because we'll have more than one query. All right, so get clients. Now we can just bring that in to our clients component. So right here, let's say import get clients from the client queries folder, and we should get the same exact result. All right, now that loading, you can keep that if you want, but I'm just going to create a spinner component real quick because Bootstrap does have a spinner, so we don't even need like a GIF or anything. So I'm going to create a file called spinner in the components, and let's say RFC. Okay, and then what we're going to do is add, let's get rid of this, and we're just going to add in here class name, and I want to use flexbox because I want to center it, so we'll do dflex, and then let's say justify content dash center, and then we'll have our spinner border div here. Go ahead and add that, and then close that div. So that should do it. Now, if we go to clients and bring in spinner, So we'll import spinner, spinner from, yeah, it's in the same folder. And then we're just going to replace this paragraph here. So when it's loading, then we just want to show the spinner. So let's go ahead and reload. Oh, it's showing the text of loading. So yeah, let's get rid of that. Okay, so now if we reload, there we go. I think that it just gives, it makes the UI look a little better than just showing the text. All right, so now I think we should do the delete mutation, right? When we delete a client, that's not going to be a query, that's going to be a mutation. So we're going to have a folder. Let's see. So in the source folder, we're going to have another folder called Mutations. And let's create a file here called client mutations.js, and we're going to import GQL from Apollo client. And then as far as the mutation, it's going to be, you know, the same thing we would do in GraphiQL. So we do want to give it a name here. Let's say delete underscore client, set that to GQL with some backticks, and then mutation. Oops, we should be, no, that's right. We'll say mutation, and then name it delete client, and then whatever we need to pass in is going to go in here. So it's going to be an ID, and it's going to be the type of ID. And then we want to call this delete client and then pass that ID in, and then whatever we want returned will go in here. So I'm going to want the ID, the name, the email, and the phone, and we'll close that up. Okay, so that's our delete client mutation. Let's go ahead and export it. So we want to export delete client. Good. So now we'll close that up, and the client queries for now, and the spinner and the client row is where we want this to happen, because that's where the button is. So that's where you can see that this is basically Apollo is our state manager, because we can bring in any queries or any mutations that we want into any component, even if it's 5 levels deep. There's no passing, there's no prop drilling or anything like that, which is really cool. And just that alone is a reason to consider using Apollo and GraphQL. All right, now as far as what we're going to do here, we need to bring in the use mutation hook. Just like there's a use query hook, we can import use mutation, and that's going to be from Apollo, not React hooks, Apollo/client. All right, and in addition to that, we want to import the actual mutation of delete client, but that's going to be in client mutations, and this should be mutations. Right, we're going up one level into it, yeah. And then what we'll do is, let's see, the way that we use the use mutation hook is we'll go in the function, and we're going to do const, and then in brackets say delete mutation, delete client, and then set that to use mutation, and then pass in the delete client mutation from that from the folder. All right, now obviously we need to know which client we're deleting. So if we want to pass values in, we simply pass in a second parameter of an object, and we add a variables object to that and set whatever we want to pass in. In this case, it's an ID. We're going to get it from client.id, which is the client we're talking about, because here we're looping through all the clients and creating a client row for each one, passing in the specific client, and we can get that ID from here. All right. Now, on the button, we can just simply say on click and set that now to delete client. I keep wanting to write delete mutation. So let's save that, and we'll come over here, and I actually want to create a new client to delete. Now we don't have that functionality in our application, but we do have it here. So let's see, do I have an add client? Yeah, right here. So this add client will add a test client. So let's go ahead and run that. Right, and then if I go, actually I'm going to put this back on here. Okay, and now if I go back to my project and reload, we have a test client. So I'm going to click on the delete button, and you'll notice that nothing happens, right? Nothing in the UI changes, but if I reload, it's gone. So we have, it is correctly calling the mutation in our API, but it's not reflecting in the front end. Now, there's a couple ways to solve this. One, we can refetch the queries. We can basically call get clients again, or we could update the cache where we don't actually have to make a complete request again. All right, so I'm going to show you both ways. So the first way is to just, like I said, refetch the clients. So we would do this, refetch queries, and we would just set an array, because you can call more than one query, but we're just calling one of get clients. So we do need to bring that in. So we want to import get clients from our queries, and then that should just refetch it. So now I'm going to add that client again through here, reload. So now we have a test client, and if I click the trash icon, now it goes away in the UI because it refetches it. So that's absolutely fine in this situation, but if you do that too much and you're starting to call multiple queries or whatever, you might start to bog down your application. So there's another way to do it, and that's just to update the cache. So I'm going to show you that way as well. So let's see, is this right? I can just do this. Yeah, we should be able to do this. So we're going to call, just make sure I close this correctly. Is that right? This ends there. No, I don't need that. So we have a function called update that we can call. We can pass in cache, and then here we're setting the data to the response of delete client. And if we look at our mutation, if we look at the delete client mutation, we're getting back the ID, name, email, and phone, which is all the stuff that we need, right? So now down here, we're going to say const, yeah, we'll just use this. So const clients, and we're going to get it from the cache. Okay, it's going to basically get the query from the cache. It's not going to make a whole new request. And then we're going to write to the cache with cache write query, and using the get clients, and then we're setting the data here. We're setting clients in our data to filter out the client that matches the ID of the one that we want to delete. All right, so client.id, so that's, it's looping through, and it's seeing if it matches the deleted client's ID, and then it's filtering it out. So let's save that, and okay, we'll save that, and now once again I'll add the test client. Let's come over here and reload, and let's click the button, and it goes away. Now you may see this warning here. So it says cache data may be lost when replacing the clients field of a query object. And to address this problem, we can define a custom merge function so that in-memory cache can safely merge these objects, the existing object and the incoming object, meaning the clients. So there is some solutions down here, but ultimately I found the solution on Stack Overflow, and we just need to add a little bit of code to our app.js so that we don't have to deal with that warning. So right above the client, we're going to create a variable called cache, and we're going to set that to new in-memory cache, just like we have right here, except we're going to pass some stuff in here. So we have an object, and we're going to create a type policies object, and then a query object, and then the fields, and we want to deal with clients at the moment. So in clients, we're going to have a merge function, just like it said in the warning. and we're going to pass in the existing. So this will be the existing and the incoming data, and we're going to return the incoming. Okay, now that should get rid of it, but I'm also going to add it for projects. So I'm just going to copy this. So we'll just put a comma right here, paste that in, and then let's also add projects so that we don't get this message later on with projects. And now if we reload this, and if we add a new client, come over here and we click delete. Oh, you know what? All I did was create the variable. I didn't actually implement it. So down here, instead of new in-memory cache, we're just going to use the cache variable. So that should work now. Let's go ahead and add that. And then if we click delete, now that warning goes away. Okay, so we're able to fetch clients and we're able to delete them. So I think next what we should do is add the form to create them, to create clients from our application, as opposed to having to come over here in graphical. So we can delete client row. Yeah, we can get rid of, or not get rid of, but close clients. And we're going to be using a modal. Okay, if you want, you can use a React router. You could have another page where you have the form, or you could just embed the form right in here. But I think having a modal is a nice way to do it. So in components, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this add client modal.jsx. And we'll create a React component here. Let's get rid of this. We're going to need a few things here. For one, we're going to bring in use state because we will have a form and each field will be a piece of component state. So we want to bring in that. I'm also going to bring in the FA user icon. So that's going to come in from React icons. We're going to be using a mutation, so we'll import that. And then let's import from, actually this is all we'll do for now. Okay, now as far as the modal goes, we could just copy from, I want to leave that open. We'll copy from getbootstrap.com. If we go to examples, just make this a little bigger here. Should be on the side. Oh, docs. All right. So down here, let's grab under components, you'll see modal. And then there's this example right here where we have the button. If we click it, it opens up a modal. So that's what I want. I'm going to grab this button and the modal, copy that. And then let's add that to our component. Now, this has to be wrapped in a single element, so what we'll do is just make this into a fragment, and then we'll paste that in, and make sure you get rid of this comment here, or that will mess things up. So if I go ahead and save that, and let's bring it into our app.js. So we'll say import add client modal, and then we're going to put this in the container right above clients. And now we should see, what's this? Oh, class. So in the add client modal, of course, we have to change all the classes to class names. So I'll select this one and then just Command D, select them all and change them to class name. Get rid of that error. Or it should. What's this? Oh, this is for tab index. So right here, tab index, we can just get rid of that completely. Okay, so now we have a modal. If I click it, it opens it up. So let's start to change some stuff here. We're going to change this to add client. This is the button. And as far as, let's see, as far as the classes go, I'm going to do button secondary for this. And then all of the instances of example modal, I'm going to change that. So let's take this. I think there's 3 or 4 of them. and I'm going to change it to add client modal. Makes more sense. And then let's see, for the button here, I'm going to add the icon as well. So let's use a flexbox class. So we'll say d-flex, and then I want to align items center. And first we'll have the FA user icon. I have a custom class of icon that just pushes the text, adds some margin on the right. And then we'll have a div with the text of add client. So let's take a look. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now we'll come down to the modal and let's change some of this stuff. The title here, we'll say add client. And then let's see, we have the close button. The body is where everything's going to go. The footer, I'm actually going to get rid of it. So the modal footer, get rid of that. And then in the body is where we're going to have our form. Okay, and then inside the form, we're going to have a class of margin bottom 3 that goes around both the label and the input. So for the label, I'm not even going to use the HTML4 attribute, but I do want to add a class name of form-label. And this particular one is going to be the name. All right, so that, and then we'll do the input, and this is going to have a class of form, let's say form-control. These are just bootstrap classes. And it's going to be type text. So we'll give it an ID of name, and let's give it a value. Actually, before we do the value, we want to add our state. All right, so I'll just save that as is, and we should just see the field. But we need to connect the value to a piece of state. So up here, and I'm expecting you guys at least know the basics of React and know how to use the useState hook. But basically, we want to set the name, the email, and the phone. So this should be set phone and phone. So these are the fields of the form, right? And then to change any of these, to mutate these pieces of state, we simply call these functions here: set name, set email, set phone. So on the input, we're going to set the value of this to whatever the state of the name in the state. Okay, and then on change, meaning when we type in this field, we're going to want to call a function. We're just going to use an arrow function, and we're going to update it with set name. And what we want to update it to is whatever is typed in, which we can get from e.target.value. Okay, so if I were to, I'm just going to reload this. If I were to go to components, and this is just the React Dev tools if you're not familiar with them. If we look at the add client modal, and let's see, I'm trying to get this so that we can see it. So the add client modal, if I start to type in here, we should see down here in the state, that starts to change to whatever I type in. So now we just want to do it with the email and phone as well. So we'll copy this div with the MB3. We'll take that, we'll just copy it down twice. And this one here will be for email. I'm going to change the type from text to email, the ID, the value from the state, and then the function to change that is going to be set email. And then we just want to do the same with phone. So ID will be phone, value, phone, and then the method to change it, set phone. All right, so we should see all the fields now. We should be able to type in here. So now we need our submit button. So let's come down here under the last div, right before the form ending form tag, and let's say button, and we're going to use btn and btn dash secondary, and we'll say submit. I'm also going to add on to this button a type of submit, And let's also, I want the modal to disappear when we submit. So there's an attribute we can put on here called data-bs-dismiss. And we just want to set that to modal. Okay, so that when we submit it, it closes. Now, we need an event for submitting. So we're on the form tag, which is right here. Let's say on submit, and we're going to set that to a function called on submit. And then we'll come up here above the return and say const on submit. And we want to set that to, actually we'll console log. So all this is going to do is submit the form, and we're going to console log the data. So let's try that out. Let's open up our console and say add client. We'll just, whoops. I keep clicking out of it. So let's say test, email, test.com, and then phone number, whatever, and submit. So the modal closes, and we're logging the data down here. Okay, so now that we have that set up, we want to run a mutation when we submit that form. So let's go into mutations and client mutations, and we want to add the add client. So I'm going to put that right above delete client. So let's do const add underscore client and set that to GQL and then some backticks, and then say mutation add client, except we don't want company. This should be phone. So name, email, phone, they're all strings. Then we're going to call add client and pass that data in, and then specify what we want to return from it, which is going to be the ID, the name, the email, and the phone. Okay, so we'll save that, and actually we need to export it. So down here, let's say add underscore client, save that. And this warning, let's see what this is. GQL is defined but never used. I'm just going to get rid of that. So right here, we don't need this in clients anymore. Use mutation, that's fine. All right, so now that we have add client, let's go back to the modal here, and we're going to want to bring that in. So let's say import add client from client mutations. And then we're going to need to update the cache as well. So I'm also going to bring in the get clients as well, the get clients query. And then we're going to go down here, and just like we did with the delete, we're going to say const add client. Let's just close that up. All right, so we're setting it to use mutation, passing in add client, and then anything that we want to pass in as far as variables is going to go in this object in a variables object. And we want the name, email, and phone to be passed in. And then we want to update the cache so that when we add it, we see the client show up in the UI. So we're going to add, you could do refetch queries like it says here, but a cleaner way to do it is to use update. We're going to pass in cache, and then data, add client. So this will give us back whatever we return from that add client, meaning this stuff here. All right, and then inside the update, we're going to, let's see, yeah, we're going to do just that. So we read from the cache, get the clients, reading from this query from the cache, and then we write to the clients, and we're setting the data to just concat the new client onto the current clients. You could do that, or you could do you could use a spread operator. So we could just do ... clients, and then we could put the add client data that's returned. So now we just want to go into our on submit and we can get rid of the console log. And I just want to do just a little bit of validation first. So we'll just make sure that there's a name, email, and phone. If they're missing something, we'll just return an alert and say, please fill in all fields. Okay, and then we'll call add client. We'll pass in name, email, phone from our state, from the form. And then we want to just clear those up, clear the form, and that should do it. So let's try it out. We'll say add client. Let's add Steve Rogers, and email we'll do captain@gmail, and then phone number we'll do that and submit. And there we go. So it gets added right away because we updated the cache. If we didn't do that, we'd have to reload the page. Cool. So I think we're pretty much done with client functionality. Later on, I do want to add the functionality where if we delete a client, it also deletes their projects, but we'll do that later. So now we want to start to deal with projects. And I think the first thing we should do with that is just display them, right? I believe we have some in the database here. If we look at, let's see, projects, we run that. Yeah, so we have 2 projects, mobile application and e-commerce website right now, or at least I do. I mean, you guys have whatever you added. So I think what we should do first is add the project queries. So let's go into the queries folder. Let's create a new file called project queries.js. And then we're going to want to, of course, get our projects. So let's import GQL. And that's going to be from Apollo, not Apollo Boost. That's Apollo Client. And then let's go ahead and say const get underscore projects. Set that to GQL and some backticks. And then inside the backticks, we're going to do a query, get projects. And let's say from projects, we want to get, as far as the fields, we want the ID, the name, and status. Because that's what I want to show on the cards, because we're going to have some project cards at the top. And then let's export it. So down here, we're going to export the get projects. And we'll close that up for now. And in components, let's create a new file here called projects.jsx. Okay, and then there's a couple things that we're going to want to bring in here. I'm going to bring in the spinner because we're going to do the same thing that we did with the clients, where when it's loading, we show a spinner. We also want to bring in the use query hook. So use query, that's going to be from Apollo Client. And then let's bring in the get projects that we just created. That's not the right path. We want to go, let's see, we're in components. We want to go up 1 level into queries, and then we want project queries. All right, so to get the projects, let's go right above the return. And remember, we have this use query hook, and we can pass in here get projects. That's the query we want to get our data from. And then we can destructure, and we can pull from that loading, error, and data. Okay, so we can get that. And then let's first just say if loading, we'll return a spinner. And if there's an error, then I'm just gonna say something went wrong. Then let's come down here and let's just make this an empty fragment. And before I actually map through the projects, I want to make sure that there are some projects. Otherwise, we'll just show a message. So let's go ahead and say data. We'll say data.projects.length. If that is greater than 0, then we'll do something else. We'll just do or show something and show something else. The else is just going to be a paragraph, and we'll say no projects. Okay, and then in here, if there are projects, then I'm going to want to have a div with the class of row, and then in here is where we're going to map through our projects. So we'll say data.projects.map, and in here we're going to have an arrow function, pass in our project, and I actually want to have a component called project card. So we'll say project card, and then that's going to take in a key and the project itself, and we'll use the project ID for the key. All right, now let's add this project's component to our app.js file. So I'm just going to copy this clients down and bring in projects. And then we're going to put that right above clients down here. Okay, we're going to get an error because project card is not defined. All right, so we're going to want to create that in components. So project card.jsx. All right, so project card is going to take in a prop of project, and then since this is wrapped in a class of row, this is going to be a column. So let's get rid of this text right here, and this wrapping div is going to have a class name of call-md-4, and then we're going to have a class of card and margin bottom 3, and then we have our card body class. And then in here, we're going to have a class display flex. And let's say justify content between. And let's also do align items. We'll do align items center. All right. And then in there, we'll have our H5, and that's going to be the card title. And that will have the project name. So project.name. Now if I save this, this should work. Actually, no, we need to bring project card in here. So let's do that. Import project card. All right, so on smaller screens, it'll stack. On larger screens, it'll be side by side. I do want to have some spacing here, so why don't we add, let's see, actually on the row right here, let's say MT, we'll try MT3, maybe MT5, or 4, whatever you think looks good, doesn't really matter. Okay, so now we have the name here. In addition to that, let's go into our project card. We're going to have a link. I know we haven't set up the React router yet, so we'll just, I guess we'll make this an A tag for now. And where I want this to go is going to be, let's see, we're going to add some backticks in here, and it's going to go to /projects and then / the ID. So project.id. And I'm going to make this look like a button, so we're going to say class name btn, and let's do btn-light, and we'll say view. So let's save that. So now we have our little view button. And then the last thing I want to show here is the status. So that's going to go under this div. This is the Flexbox div. I'm going to go underneath that, and we're going to have a paragraph with the class of small, which will just give it small text. We'll say status, and I'm going to just add some strong tags. And then in here, we'll say the project.status. All right, cool. Now, obviously, this isn't going to go anywhere because we haven't set up the router yet, but at least we have our project cards. And if you want to change the columns, you can. Maybe if we do like 6, that'll be, I think that actually looks better to have them side by side like that. Just 2 instead of 3. Well, yeah, I guess that's okay. It's really whatever you prefer. Since I'm going to be using small screens like this size, I guess we'll just keep it like that. So next step, we have our project cards, but we want to be able to have a separate page where we can view the description, and we can also have like an edit form. We can update it, delete it, and so on. So I think now is the time we should start to implement the router. All right, at the moment, we just have our app.js, and we're just kind of piling components in here. So I think that maybe we'll have a pages folder, and this will be basically like our homepage component. So first off, we already have, or you should have in your client-side dependencies, you should have the React Router DOM. I'm using version 6.3.0 right now. But yeah, we want to get that set up. So at the top here, I'm going to go ahead and import, let's say, browser router. I just use GitHub Copilot, but it's using version 5 of the router where they use switch. Now we use routes, not switch. The rest is okay. And then we need to wrap. Let's come down here. We're going to go inside the Apollo provider and wrap everything with the router. So we want this ending router tag to go right here. And we'll just wrap all that. And let's see. Yep, that should still work. Now we want to create some pages. So I'm just going to close these up. And in the source folder, we're going to create a folder called pages. At least this is how I like to structure my React applications. Kind of like Next.js, where you have your route, your pages. So let's create a file here called home.jsx. And then I'm also going to set up a not found page. So let's say not found.jsx. And then let's also create a project.jsx. So that will be like the single project page. Now for the home, this is going to be basically what we're looking at here. So let's first off do a React component, and then let's see. I'm going to just make this a fragment. And then we're going to want, let's see, from our app.js, I'm going to want the modal, the projects, the clients. So let's see, I'm trying to figure out how we should structure this. All right, you know what we'll do is just grab these and cut those. And then here I'm going to put routes, and let's end routes. And then here we're going to have a path for the home page, which is going to go to the home page or home component. And then let's go to our home page or component, and we'll go ahead and paste this stuff in. Trying to think of, because we're going to have another button here, so we should probably put those, yeah, let's put those in a flex box, the modal buttons. So I'm just going to have a class of dFlex. So display flex will have gap 3 and margin bottom 4, and then we're going to move this modal component into that. All right, and then I'm just going to put an HR in between the projects and clients. So now we can go to our app.js and we can get rid of these 3 imports, but we do need to import our home component. So let's say import home from, it's not going to be in components, it's going to be in pages. So pages/home. Let's see what we get here. So add, oh, did I not? we need to import that stuff. So let me just grab that. Okay, and then we're going to go to home, and we need to import those components, but they're going to be up one level because we're in pages right now. So we want to add another dot here. Right now we're on project / something. We need to go to our home page. And there we go. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. We still have our modal. Now, before we get to the project pages, let's do the not found, because it's good to have a page that, a 404 page if people go to some route that doesn't exist. So let's create a new component here, and I'm just going to bring in an icon. So let's say import. It's going to be from React React-icons/FA. And the icon that I want is going to be FA exclamation right here, exclamation triangle. And then we're also going to import the link. So we want to bring in link from React Router DOM. And then let's come down here, and why does that have quotes around it? That's weird. Okay. Let's get rid of this here. And let's see, we'll have a div that wraps everything and just add some classes on this. So we'll do a display flex. Let's make it a flex column. Yeah, flex column. Justify dash content dash center and align dash items dash center. And let's do a margin top 5. And then inside here, we're going to have our exclamation triangle. Size, we'll see what 5M looks like. And then underneath that, let's put an H1, and we'll just put a 404. Okay, and then we'll have a paragraph with the class of lead. And we're going to say, sorry, this page does not exist. And then finally, we'll have a link to go back home. So let's say link, I'm just going to go to / and let's close that up. And we'll just say go back. All right, so let's save that. Now we want to bring this into our app.js. So just like we brought in home, we're going to bring in pages not found. And let's say not found. And then we'll come down here where we have our routes. And you want to make sure this is the last route that we create. And it's just going to be a path to an asterisk. And we're going to load not found as an element. All right, so if I were to go now to /test, which doesn't exist, I'm going to get this 404 page. And I can just click go back. All right, so now we can start to work on the single project page. So if I click view right here, it doesn't exist right now, but we're going to create in pages project, let's create a function or component. And I'll just save this as is, and let's bring it into app.js. So we'll do project, and then down here, let's go right here. We want to have a route for a project. The path is going to be project /:ID, and the element will be the project page. So now if I have this URL here and I reload, actually, hold on a second. Let's click view. Wait, why isn't that working? Oh, so I have projects in the URL, which I think I'm going to do that. Yeah. All right. So now we're able to see that component. Now, to get a single project, we're going to need to write another query. So let's go to our queries and project queries. We have this one which gets all of our projects, but now we want one to get a single project. So we'll call it get underscore project, set that to GQL. And we'll say query projects. We need to pass in the ID of the one that we want. And then we want to return a project, pass in the ID, and the data from that we want to bring, that we want to return is going to be basically everything. The ID, the name, the description, anything we want to have on the page, the status, and then also the client data. So from the client, we want to have the ID, ID, name, what else? Email, phone. All right, and then we just want to export that as well. Okay, so we can close that up. We should be all set there. And now let's go to our project page. And let's see, there's a few things we want to do here. We want to bring in. So I'm going to bring in two things from React Router DOM. We want link, and I'm also going to bring in the use params hook, because we need to be able to get the ID from the URL, and we can do that with use params. And then we also want to bring in the spinner, and we want to bring in the use query hook, and we also want to bring in the query we just created, get project, and that should do it for now. And then let's come up here and let's get the ID. We can destructure that. We can destructure that from use params. So we want to get the ID. That will get the ID from the URL. Then we're going to set, let's say, const. Yep, we want to get the loading, error, and data from the get project query. Wait, what is? Yeah, sometimes this doesn't do the right thing. All right, there we go. So now that we get that, let's, we need to pass the ID in as a variable. So as a second argument, we're going to pass in an object with a variables. I can't see. Variables, and we're going to set that to the ID. Let's get rid of this. That was just extra. Okay, and then we're going to check to see if it's loading. If so, we'll have a spinner. And you can see how Copilot is catching on to like what I want to do. It knows that in the other components, I've been doing this, something went wrong. So I really, really like Copilot. I know some of you might kind of be aggravated with me using it because it, pops so much stuff on the screen, but it really helps, especially for me where I'm not a very fast typer. So I like when it fills in what I need. All right, now down here, let's well, you know what? Let's just save this as is and see. So it's just going to say project here, but let's go to our network tab. I don't think I've even done this yet with you guys. Go to the network tab and see the query. So if we look at GraphQL, you'll see that in the response, we're getting back the project, get the ID, the name, description, status, and also the whole client object as well with all that data. So we know we're getting it, we're just not displaying anything yet. So let's come down here, and in the return, actually let's make this a fragment, and then we're going to just check, let's say if not loading and not error, then we're going to, let's do a class, we'll do mx-auto, and let's do a width. I want it to be kind of narrow, so I'm going to do a width of 75, and then make it a card, so it has a border, and then padding 5 around it. All right, and then in here, let's, I'm going to have a backlink, so we're going to use link here and say to, we'll say to not projects. We want this to go back to /, And let's see, for the classes here, we're going to do button light. We don't need MB3. What I do want is button dash SM and a width of 25 and display it as inline and also MS Auto. And we want to close the link and the text is just going to say back. So if I, whoa, oh no, that's fine. I thought that this was the border to the button. Yeah, so we're just going to have this border, this card, and we have our back button. So now let's continue on. Let's go under the back link, and we'll have an H1, and this is going to be the project name. So let's say project, data.project.name. There we go. And then underneath that, and again, if you guys don't like the design or the layout that I'm doing here, of course you can change it to whatever you want. But underneath that, we're going to have the description. And then underneath that, I'm going to have an H5, give it a class of margin top 3. And this is going to be the heading for the status. So we'll say project status. And then underneath that, let's do a paragraph with the class of lead. And in here, we're going to have the data.project.status. Okay, so you can see completed. And then, yeah, I do want to have the client info as well, but I think what we'll do is put that into a different component. So, yeah, we'll come down here and we'll say, we'll have a component called client info, and we'll pass in the client, which is data project.client, and that will have the name, email, phone, and so on. So we'll save that. That's going to break, and then we'll just create that component. So let's say client info.jsx, and then let's do a component, and it's going to take in the client. And I'm going to bring in some icons as well from React Icons. So from React Icons /FA. And I want to bring in FA envelope. And let's do FA phone. And let's do FA ID badge. Okay, and then down here we'll have empty fragment, and we'll have a heading. Let's do H5 margin top 5, and we'll say client information. Okay, and then underneath that, we're going to have a UL with the class of list group, list dash group, and each list item is going to have a class of list dash group dash item. And in each one, we're going to have the badge, and we're going to have a class name of icon to push the text over a little bit. And this one is going to be the client.name. All right, so let's actually just copy this down twice, and this one here is going to be FA envelope, and it's going to be the email. And then this one's going to be client.phone, and the icon is going to be FA phone. All right, so now we can bring this client info component into our project. So let's add that. We'll go right here. Let's say import client info, and that's going to be from, let's see, we're in pages right now, so we want to go up into components. And let's save that. Okay, so now we can see the client data. If we go to this one here, good. So before we do anything else on the project page, because I do want to have a delete button and also the ability to update some fields, but I think we should do the add project modal, because I want to have a button here to do the same kind of thing. Open up a modal so we can add a new project, and also pick a client for that project. So let's actually, we're done with project card. We can close that up, and then we'll close up, what's this? Projects. We'll just close that up for now and close that. We'll just close all this stuff up, except for home, because that's where we do want to show the modal. Now what I'm going to do is actually take everything in the add client modal and copy it, because this one's going to be very similar. It's just going to have some different fields. So we'll copy that, and then let's create a new file called add project modal.jsx. And then we'll go ahead and paste that in, and let's just start to change some of this stuff. So at the top here, we want to bring in use state. As far as the icon, I'm going to bring in FA list for that, for the button. And then we need use mutation. We also want use query. So we're going to bring both of those in. We do want, let's see, we want get projects, which we do have as a query, right? If we look in project queries, yeah, we actually want get projects because we want that for the cache, right? When we add a project, we want it to show automatically. So we want that. And then, of course, we need to create a mutation. But let's change this to get projects. And that's going to come from queries and then project queries. And then for this is going to be add project, but I'm just going to get rid of that for now. And then down here, as far as our fields, we do have a project name, and then we have a description. So this will be set description. What else? We have client ID. So let's change phone to client ID. That'll be set client ID. And these are all just going to be empty strings. Now the status, let's copy this down because we do want to have status. And by default, we're going to set that to new. And remember, that's an enum, so we don't put the actual value. The value of new is what, not started. This is the key, right? And then you have what, progress is the key for in progress, and then we have completed is the key for, I think it's still completed. And then down here, let's see, before we get into this right here, let's come down here and let's go down to the actual component. So the button where it says add client modal, let's take all those. Whoops, not that one. We want this one, this one, this one, and this one. We're going to change it to add project modal. Okay, and then let's change, I'm going to change the color to button primary. And we're going to change this here. So the button text is going to say new project. And we're also going to change the icon to FA list. All right, now down here in the actual modal, I'm going to change that to add project, or we'll say new project. And then in the body is where we have all the form fields, so we want to change those. We do have a name, so this one can stay the same. Then we have a description, so let's change this email to description. You know what, let's close that up. Now the description is going to be a text area, so what I'll do is we'll change this input to text area, and we just want to add an ending tag because it's a text area. Okay, and then we can get rid of this type. We're going to keep the class name, the ID, we'll change that to description, and then the value, state value, description, and set description for the function here. Okay, and then what else? We have status. So let's change that, say status. And this is actually going to be a select list. So I'm just going to get rid of this whole input, and we're going to do a select. And let's do, actually I'm going to give it a class of form-select. And then we don't need a name. ID is going to be status, class name, and then we're going to have a value on this as well. So let's say value, set that to the status in our state. And then this needs an onChange event. So let's say onChange. We're going to set that to a function. Just like the rest of the fields, we're just going to now set status and set it to whatever the value is. So e.target.value. All right, and then we need some options. So within the select, let's add an option. And for the value, we'll do new. And for the text, we'll say not started. All right, and then let's do this one will be in progress. The key will be progress. And then completed. And completed. All right. Now the client is going to be a drop down as well, but we need to fetch those clients. So I'm not going to do that just yet. Let's change this color to primary. So I'll save it, and let's try to just put it in the home page, embed it, just like we have the add client modal. Just going to change that to project. And then we'll put it right after the add client modal. All right. So it looks like we have a bunch of stuff that's not defined. Let's see, email is not defined. Where is email? Oh, all this up here. You know what? Let's comment out. Actually, we'll just delete that. Let's just delete that. We'll write it when the time comes. And then in the on submit, let's just change. Let's see, we're going to check email, name, description. What else? Status. Yeah, so we'll check those, return the alert, and then let's just get rid of that. And then we just want to empty all the fields. So we're doing the same exact thing that we did with the add client modal. It's just different fields. Status, and let's set set client ID. All right, actually for the set status, let's set that to the new. Actually, we want quotes around it. There we go. All right, so at least now we can see new project, and if we click it, we now have this form. Now, like I said, to choose a client, we need to actually make a query to get the clients to fill the select box. So we already have get clients, or yeah, right, get clients. So we need to bring that in. And what I'm talking about is in queries, client queries, this right here, because we need to display them in the select box, so we need to call that. So let's come down here and add Project Modal, and let's import get clients. And then the way we're going to do this, let's see. The way we're going to do this is let's go right above the on submit here. Let's say get clients for select. So we'll say const and loading error data. Okay, we're going to get clients. And then actually, you know what? We don't want anything. We don't want this to try to load until we're done fetching the clients. So let's add Should I put it right here? Yeah, let's say if loading, then let's return. I think I brought the spinner in already. Oh, I didn't. So we're actually, you know what? I don't even want to use the spinner. So we'll just say if loading, return, we'll just say return null. It's kind of weird to have a spinner for the clients in a modal. All right, so let's see. If, we'll say if there's an error, then something went wrong. Actually, let's make these quotes. All right, and then I want to wrap this, because remember, I want to check to make sure that it's not loading and not error. Then we can do all this. And I'm just going to put a fragment in here because it needs to wrap around everything. We can only have, you know, a single parent element. And here we have a button and the div. So we want to grab that button and div, all this, cut it, and put it inside here. All right. So now we're getting the clients right here as data. So now let's go add another field to the form. So underneath, see, underneath the status, so right here underneath status, we're going to add a new select box. So let's do class MB3 div, and we're going to do, let's say, label. We don't need that. We'll do label with a class name of form-label, and this is going to say client. Okay, and then we need our select. So let's do select class of form-select, and we don't need a name. ID will be client. Actually, let's do client ID. And also, I'm going to add, let's see, we're going to add a value to this. So value is going to be client ID, which is part of our state. And let's also add our onChange and set that to a function. And then we want to call setClientID and set that to e.target.value. All right, I think that's all we need in the select. Now, inside the select tags is where we want our options. So I'm going to have one single option that just says select, and this will just be, we'll just set this to an empty string, and we'll say select client. Now, this is where we want to actually map through the clients. So let's say data.clients.map, and then in here we want to have a function. We're going to say for each client, then we want to have an option. All right, so we'll say option. Oops, that didn't, Emmet didn't work there. Say option. We'll close that. All right, so the option has a key of client ID and a value of the ID of the client, but the text we want to show is going to be the name. So here we'll say client.name. So let's save that and we'll give it a shot. If I click new project, you see select client, and now we have a list of the current clients. Okay, so if we add a new client, it's going to show here. All right, so now we want to handle the actual submission. So that's where we need a new mutation to add a project. So let's open up Mutations, and let's create a new file here called Project Mutations.js. All right, so we want to import GQL from Apollo client. You can see a lot of this is really repetitive, so it's not that difficult. I know that there's a lot of syntax, there's a lot of things, but once you start to get used to it, it's not that bad. So for add project, let's do const add underscore project. Set that to GQL backticks, and this is going to be a mutation. So we'll say mutation add project. Okay, and then that's going to take in name, which is a string, description, string, client ID, which is going to be an ID, and then we also want a status. So I'm going to pop that in there as well. So let's say money sign status colon, and then that's going to be a type of project status. We want to put an exclamation there as well. Now this project status comes from the back end. If you remember, seems like a long time ago that we did this, but if we look at, let's see, where's our mutations? So the add project status is it's an enum type, and it has the name of project status. So that's what we're referring to here. All right, this project status. And then in here, we want to add our add project with the values. So description, status, client ID, and then what we want to get back, which is going to be basically everything. So we'll do ID, name, description, status, status, and then for the client, we want the client name, email, phone, and also the ID. All right, and that should do it. So now let's export this. So we're going to do export add project. Okay, and then let's go back to our modal, and that's where we want to implement this. So up at the top here, we're gonna bring that in because we haven't brought it in yet. So let's say import, and we're gonna bring in add project from our mutations. Okay, and then let's go back into the component here, right below the state, and let's say const. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, so we're setting this add project to use mutation, and then we're passing in the add project mutation. Then we have to pass a second parameter here of an object with our variables. And the variables are going to be the name, description, client ID, and status. So that will do it. That will add the project. But remember, we want to update our cache, right? When I click add project and I submit this, I'm going to want it to show here without having to reload the page. And again, you could do refetch, but I would suggest just doing an update. So let's say update. We want to pass in here cache, and then, this should be curly braces, and then we're going to say data, and we can get the data from what's returned from that add project. Then we want to set the projects from the query in the cache, and then we're going to write to the cache and set the data to the projects with the added project concatenated onto it. And again, if you don't want to use concat, which I don't usually use, we could replace that with just an array and then spread the current projects and then add the new project, which is returned from this from the add project mutation. All right, and then finally we need to call this add project function. So let's come down here, and right after where we do the validation, we'll say add project, and we just want to pass in here the fields, so name, description, client ID and status. All right, so let's save that. And now we should be all set. So we'll say new project. I'll just say design prototype and say this is a description, and then status, I'll keep it at not started, and I'll select Steve Rogers and submit, and there we go. So it shows up right away. If we reload, it should still show up. Cool. And the reason we see two of these two spinners is because one is for the clients, one is for the projects. If you want, you can remove one of them from one of those components if you don't want to see two of them. All right, now the next thing, we have a couple more mutations because I do want to be able to delete projects and I want to be able to update some of the details of a project. So that, let's see, we can close the modal. We can close the home page. Let's see. Yeah, we can even close app.js. This is going to go in the project page. So in pages, we have our project JSX. That's what we're looking at right here. So I want to add the delete button. So let me just, let's go down here. So we have our project status, we have our client info. So I'll have the edit form embedded in here as well, and then underneath that will be the delete button. Now the delete button, I'm going to actually put it in its own component because we need to call a mutation, and I think cluttering this file up even more, it probably isn't a great idea. So let's create a component. I'm going to embed a component right now that doesn't exist, but we'll create it. I'm going to call it delete project button, and it's going to take in, let's say, the ID. Actually, yeah, we could do that, or we could just pass in ID from use params. And I actually just want to call this project ID. All right. Now, if I save that, we're going to get an error because that doesn't exist. So let's go into components and let's create delete project button.jsx. And we'll say RFC and get rid of that. Save. Let's see, why is that not working? Oh, because I didn't bring it in. So in our project file, let's bring that component in. So we want to import delete project button. Okay, and then let's see, how do we want to format this? So it's going to be a button, and then we're going to call a mutation, and then we're going to, should we redirect? Yeah, we'll redirect back to the home page. All right, so I'm going to bring a couple things in up top. First is going to be use navigate from the router so that we can redirect. So that's going to be from React Router DOM. I'm also going to bring in the trash icon. So let's say FA trash from React icons. And we're also going to want get projects because we're going to update the cache. So we're going to import the get projects query. Get projects. And then we also need the use mutation. And then we need to create a mutation to delete the project. So let's do that. We'll go into Project Mutations, and we already have this add project. So now we're going to want to create the delete, which is going to be really simple. So we'll say const delete underscore project. And all we want to do here is create a mutation. We'll call it delete project. It's going to take in an ID. Then we have delete project where we pass in the ID, and we're just going to return the ID. Okay, so that's it. And then we'll just export that. And then let's go back into our component here, and we're going to want to bring that in. So let's import delete project. All right, and then we're going to create the button down here. So let's get rid of this, and we'll have a div. Let's give it a couple classes. So I want it to display as a flexbox and margin top 5, and let's do ms-auto. That'll push it to the right. And then inside here we'll have a button. Let's do btn and btn-danger, and let's do a margin. Let's do M2. All right, and we're going to put our trash icon and then delete project. Okay, so now we have this button here. It doesn't do anything yet, so let's add a on click, and we're going to set that to call delete project, and then we're going to come up here and create that. All right, now before we create that, I just want to initialize use navigate so that we can redirect once we do this. And then we're going to say const delete project, set that to the mutation. Then we're going to pass in an object, and let's say variables. Variables, we're going to set the ID to the project ID, which actually we have to bring in up here, because we passed that in as a prop from the project page. All right, now before I do refetch queries or update cache, whatever you want to do, I do want to navigate to the home page when this is completed. So we can actually pass in here on completed and set that to a function. And in that function, we're just going to call navigate to the home page. All right, then I'm actually just going to do refetch queries. All right, instead of updating the cache. So let's save that, and that should do it. And I'm just going to add a dummy project to delete. So we'll just put whatever in here. Okay, so that gets added. Let's go to view. Okay, if we click delete project, there we go. So it deletes, and we are redirected to the home page. All right, so the last thing to do is we want to be able to update some of these values, like the description and stuff like that. So I'm going to embed a form, an edit form, into the page. So we can close that up, and let's see, on this project page, I'm going to have another component, because I don't want to clutter this up too much. So under where we brought in the delete button, let's bring in a component called edit project form, which we haven't created yet, but we will. And that's going to be from our components. And then we'll come down here, and let's see, we're going to put this right above the delete. So right here, we'll say edit project form, and that's going to take in the project. Yeah, I'm going to pass in a prop of project, which is going to be equal to data.project. So everything. So we'll save that. It's going to break. And now we're going to go to components and create that component. So it's called edit project form.jsx. Okay, so if I save that, now we should see that error should go away, and we should see just some text down here. All right, now as far as what we need to bring in, we're going to be using, it's going to be a form, so we need use state for our fields. And then we're also going to use a mutation, so we want that. And then we want the get project query, because we want to call that after we update it. So let's say get project. We haven't created the mutation yet, so we're not going to bring that in just yet. But let's come down here, and for the form, let's give this a class name. We're going to do MT5 to push it down a little bit. Okay, and then we'll do a heading. We'll do an H3. We'll say update project details, and then underneath that we're going to have our form, no action, And then for the fields, I'm just going to copy from the add project modal. Okay, so right here we have our form. So I'm going to grab the first three divs here. So this was for the name, then we have the description, and then the status. We don't need the client. We're not going to update the client. And then we'll paste those in here. And I think, yeah, it should. Oh, we didn't add the state values. So we need to add the name, the description, and status state. So up here, let's say const name set name, description, and status. Now this is going to get passed in the entire project. Okay, and we're going to pass in as the default for the name, let's say project.name, and then we're going to do the same for description. However, I'm not going to do it for a status. The reason is because if I do project.status, that's the value. So let's say not started. Now in the back end, we're using an enum, which is a key value pair where we have new for the key and not started for the value. And if we're going to fill the form, pre-fill the status box, it needs to be with the key. And I don't know how to get that. Like if I do project status, that's the value of the enum. So if you want to fix that, you can change in the back end, instead of using an enum type, you could just set it to a string like the name and description. But I'm just going to leave this empty for, and we're still going to be able to update it. Like if we come down here, we can now see that these are pre-filled. This is not. I know it says not started here, but that's the actual value for this project. If we go to mobile application, this is completed, but this still says not started. It's not pre-filled with completed because, again, I don't know how to get the key for the enum. All right, if that makes sense. But we'll still be able to do the update. Like you'll still be able to change the status from here. It's just not going to be pre-filled. All right, so we're able to see the name and the description. Now we need to create a mutation. Actually, let's add the submit button first. So down here, we just want to add button. Let's do btn and btn-primary. Let's say submit, and let's do a type of submit. Okay, and now actually before we do the mutation, let's just add the on submit event here. We'll do on submit and set that to a function called on submit, and then we'll create that here. All right, I'll just do a quick validation like we've been doing. So we'll say, yeah, we'll just do that. And we'll return an alert. Okay, and then this is where we'll do the update, but we haven't created the mutation yet. So let's do that now. We'll go to Project Mutations, and we can close this one up. So I'm going to copy the add project mutation because it's very similar, except we just need to add the ID. So we'll grab that. We'll come down here, paste it in, and let's change this to update project. Change this to update. And then we also want to add the ID at the top here. And we don't want the client because we're not updating the client. Also, this for the status, for the enum type here, it's going to be status update. Okay, because that's what we had to set it to in the back end if we look at our schema. So for add project, it's project status, but for update, it's project status update. Okay, because we couldn't have the same for both. Now down here, let's just change that and add the ID field and get rid of the client. We're not passing that in. And then the return data will just be the same. It's just everything. And then let's go ahead and export that. Okay, so now we want to bring that into our edit form. Let's say import. And we want to bring in update project mutation. Okay, and then we'll go right above the on submit, and let's say const update project, set it to our use mutation with our update project mutation, and then pass in an object with variables. And the variables are going to be the ID, which is going to be the project that's passed in, ID, as well as the name, description, and status, which come from the form values. And then I'm just going to refetch the queries. Refetch the get project query and pass in the ID. That way it just updates right away. Okay, otherwise you're going to click submit and you're not going to see any changes here, and you're going to have to reload the page. So let's save that, and then we'll come, let me just see what this warning is. Update project is assigned but never, oh, I'm glad I looked at that, because we created this update project but we didn't call it. So down in the submit, we just have to make sure we call it and pass in the name, description, and status. All right, so let's say we want to change this to design prototype 1, and I'll change it to in progress, submit, and if we look up here, the title changed and the status. Okay, if I want to, let's get rid of that one, and then let's say we change it to completed, submit, now it's completed. Now, the last thing that I want to do is, if I have a client that's connected to a project and I delete that client, I want to delete the project as well, because then that's going to screw things up. So I want it to have a cascading effect. So we're just going to jump into the back end for a minute. We're going to go to Schema.js, and let's find where we delete a client, which is right here. So right now we're just returning this client find by ID and remove, and it just deletes the client. But let's go right above that, and I'm going to use the project model, and we're going to go ahead and find. So basically we need to find the project that has that client associated with it. So let's say find, pass in an object. We want to find where the client ID is equal to the args.id, which is the client ID, because this is the delete client. All right, then we're going to do a dot then here, and let's put an arrow function in here and just pass in projects. Okay, and then inside here what we'll do is take the projects and we're going to loop through them. In fact, this does it for me. So we're going to loop through them with for each, and then we're just going to remove it. Okay, it's just going to be any projects that are associated with that client. So even if there's 2 projects that are associated with the client, it'll delete both of them. All right, and then the only thing we have to do aside from that is go back into where we delete the client in the front end, which is in the client row. So let's see right here, and let's see, we did an update. Now, when I delete the client, I also want the project to delete on screen. So instead of using update, I'm going to actually comment that out and use refetch queries, so I don't have to add another query in there. So I want to do that, but I also want to bring in get projects, because we want that to update. So let's say import get projects, and then what we can do is in the refetch queries we can just add another. We'll put a comma right here, and we can just add query get projects, so it'll call both of those. All right, so let's save that, and now I'm going to come over here and let's create, just to kind of test everything out, we'll create a new client, test@test.com, phone number, whatever, submit, creates the client. Let's create a new project. We'll say test project, description, whatever. That's fine. Client is going to be test, and I'm going to submit. All right, so now if I click on the delete for the test client, it deletes both. So it deletes the client and the project, and if he, whatever, if they had more than one project, those would all be deleted. All right, so I just wanted to add that. So that's it. We're done. And if you want to take this further and add to it, that'd be awesome. I'd love to see it if you want to at me on Twitter. But I hope you enjoyed this. I think that it's a great project to kind of get your feet wet with both GraphQL and Apollo. And there's a lot of other tools out there. There's content management systems. There's Apollo server. There's a lot. But I think that this is kind of the bare bones of GraphQL and Apollo. So hopefully you enjoyed it, guys. I appreciate you watching it, especially if you sat all the way through it and followed along. That's awesome. But thank you again, and I'll see you soon.